Thank you so much. And it's my great honor now to introduce our scholar in his own residence. We had an opportunity to learn with Dr. Richard Elliott Friedman last night. He gave a wonderful talk on the Exodus and a provocative set of hypotheses that we all got to chew on overnight. But he's not willing to let us go just yet. And today he's going to be speaking about the Shirah. Richard Elliott Friedman earned his doctorate at Harvard in Hebrew Bible. He also earned a master's in theology at Harvard and has studied at the Jewish Theological Seminary and the University of Miami. He was a visiting fellow at Cambridge and Oxford and a senior fellow of the American Schools of Oriental Research in Jerusalem and visiting professor at the University of Haifa. He participated, as he described last night, in the City of David archaeological excavations and is now the Ann and J. Davis Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Georgia and the Katzin Professor of Jewish Civilization Emeritus at the University of California, San Diego, which is when I first encountered Dr. Friedman when he was working at UCSD and I was the rabbinic intern at the Temple Beth Am in Los Angeles, actually. He has written numerous books, including a wonderful commentary on the Torah, which for a work of biblical scholarship is decidedly religious, I would suggest. He also has written a book about the Exodus, which he spoke about last night, the disappearance of God, the hidden book of the Bible, and a beautiful polychrome edition of the Bible called The Bible with Sources Revealed. His work has been translated into 14 different languages, and it's really my honor to present and invite to speak Dr. Richard Elliott Friedman.
Thank you. Do you want me to do this in English? Or
I mean, you can choose whichever of the 14 languages you like. But you don't speak 14, right? You only speak 7 or so, right?
I speak English. Even my modern Hebrew is terrible. And in Spanish, the only thing I know, which is the most important, is una cerveza, por favor. So,
which you can't do until tomorrow night. So
no, yeah, that's a problem. No cerveza on Pesach. All right. Well, let's talk about the Song of the Sea. We just read it, and you could read it out of any book, any Bible in Hebrew or any other language, and you go, where did we get the text of that? How do we know the text of the Bible, especially Song of the Sea, which is the oldest thing in the Bible? And the reason we all have a text of the Bible to use, and that it's pretty much the same everywhere, is that we're all getting it from the same thing, which is the oldest complete Hebrew text of the Bible, which is called the Leningrad Codex, because it's in Russia, in the Russian National Library, in the city of St. Petersburg, which used to be called Leningrad. Oh, look, I just happen to have one here. It's big. So I will actually try to hold it up, and on these little screens, maybe you can see it. You see it says Leningrad Codex on the spine, and it's beautifully illustrated, and it's in a stunning Hebrew script, all done by hand. And we did my colleague David Noel Friedman went to Russia with a team of photographers, and we photographed the entire thing, so you can have the original manuscript, oldest one we know, which is 1,000 years old, which you understand in Bible terms, 1,000 years is not very much, but that's the oldest one we have. The Dead Sea Scrolls are 1,000 years older, but they're not complete. If you've ever seen pictures of Dead Sea Scrolls, they're shredded and in terrible condition, except the book of Isaiah is the only one that's complete. So here's the Leningrad Codex, and I admit it's a little strange that since the Soviet Union ended, Soviet Union was this empire they used to have in Europe that included Russia and some other places. And since the Soviet Union ended, the city called Leningrad, which had been named after John Lennon, went back to its original name, which is St. Petersburg. But they had already named this manuscript, this book of the Bible, the Leningrad Codex. So the weird thing is that the only thing now that retains the communist name of the city is the Bible. Is that not great? Does the Lord not move in strange ways? So I have it here, and I can show you how it looks. And they try to set up modern printed Bibles this way to capture it in the Hebrew. So we may or may not be able to get this up on the screen for you. If I were a real scholar, I would know how to use, proper technology. Now look, here's a typical page on one side that you see it's always 3 columns, right? But here on this side, I don't know if you can tell, but there's two columns and the middle column kind of overlaps and there's a space between them. And if you look on a typical page, it doesn't look like that. But just here, which is the Song of the Sea, it does that. So it looks like the 2 walls of water on the side and the Israelites going through in the middle. Is that cool or what?
That's cool.
They did that 1,000 years ago. So that's our text of the Song of the Sea. Now, we just read it in Hebrew. How about if I read you my translation of it, which is what I tried to do in my translation is to be as literal as possible. Usually, if you try to be really literal, you end up ruining it because it sounds like clumsy English. So I'm trying to be as literal as possible and still keep it poetic. That was the goal, and you can judge it if that was successful. I have to use the name of God when I read it because it specifically names him that way in the song, and that's how they sang it in ancient Israel. Let me sing to Yahweh, for he triumphed. Horse and its rider he cast in the sea. My strength and song are Yah, and he became a salvation for me. This is my God, and I'll praise him. My father's God, and I'll hail him. Yahweh is a warrior. Yahweh is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he plunged in the sea, and the choice of his troops drowned in the Red Sea. The deeps covered them. They sank in the depths like a stone. Your right hand, Yahweh, awesome in power. Your right hand, Yahweh, crushed the foe. And in your triumph's greatness, you threw down your adversaries. You let go your fury, consumed them like straw. And by wind from your nostrils, water was moved. Surf piled up like a heap. The deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I'll pursue, I'll catch up, I'll divide spoil. My soul will be sated. I'll unsheath my sword. My hand will deprive them. You blew with your winds, sea covered them. They sank like lead in the awesome water. Who is like you among the gods, Yahweh? Who is like you, awesome in holiness, fearsome with splendors, making miracles? You reached your right hand, earth swallowed them. You led in your kindness the people you redeemed. You ushered in your strength to your holy abode. Peoples heard, they shuddered. Shaking seized Philistia's residents. Then Edom's chiefs were terrified. Moab's chieftains trembling seized them. All Canaan's residents melted. Terror and fear came over them. At the power of your arm, they're silent like stone. Till your people passed, Yahweh, till the people you created passed. You'll bring them and plant them in your legacy's mountain, your throne's platform that you made, Yahweh, a holy place, Lord, that your hands reared. Yahweh will reign forever and ever. That's pretty good writing for 3,200 years ago.
Beautiful.
And now, the story that we have of what happened is told in the chapter before that. This, right, the Song of the Sea is Exodus 15. And the story of what happened, how they got there and all, and the sea splitting and all that is in Exodus 14, the chapter right before that. And Exodus 14 is written by 2 other authors who are hundreds of years later. Now I ask you, how did they know what happened? I said last night that the way history is written is you have to have sources that tell you, and then you draw on that to create your history. So what was the source of the writers who told you in Exodus 14 what happened? We do know the answer to that. The source of the writers in Exodus 14 was the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15 that I just read you. That was their source. They read that and they read about a people by the Red Sea, Egyptians drowning in the Red Sea, wind. If you just had only that and you hadn't seen the movie and you hadn't read the prose text, if you only had that, what would you picture? I could have put it there to you at the beginning. I've done that with my students sometimes. I say, okay, just read Exodus 15, nothing else. What do you picture happening there? You wouldn't have any waters splitting like that. You wouldn't have all the stuff that we usually picture because those were added by the prose author. But that prose author's source was this song. And this is what happens when you take something that's a music and a song, and then you make it prose, which means you have to make it more literal. So for example, there was this girl named Mary, and her pet was a little lamb. And it followed her everywhere, wherever she went, this little lamb. And one day it followed her to school. But that was bad because her school had a rule, no animals. So all the children started laughing and playing and kidding around and making noise because this little lamb was in the school. So the principal called Mary into the principal's office, and Mary was expelled. Now, what I just gave you was I hope you know the original poem. If you don't, I don't know, I can't help you. But that's what happens if you take something poetic and make it into prose. And what we have in Exodus 14 is taking that poem that we just read and making it into prose. So that poem talked about water being piled up like heaps. So in the prose version, it comes out that the water split and there are walls of water to the left and to the right of them, and the people go up the middle. But if you notice from the song, it never once said that the people went into the water. It only, they could have been anywhere around the water. It's that the Egyptians got caught in the water. It also doesn't say that the Egyptians went through on dry ground and then the water dropped on them. They just sort of, you want to know how they did that in the movie, by the way? In the movie, The 10 Commandments, I once saw Charlton Heston being interviewed, and they said, how did DeMille do that? It was such an amazing thing. They didn't have any of this tech back in those days. I mean, if you've seen the latest one, the Ridley Scott Exodus, Gods and Kings, they do it actually more correctly. But they had computer technology to make it happen. But in that movie, it was 1958, they didn't have all of that. And so Heston said, oh yeah, what they did is they had this giant empty basin, and they dumped in filled water from both sides, and then they ran the film backwards. They go, oh, like the whole audience goes, oh, that's it? That's too easy. Yeah, but that's how they did it. And this prose author had to do that too. He had to read the song and figure out a way to make it normal for them. And so the story grew from a story where Israelites have some people have something to do with the Red Sea. They're nearby or something. And the Egyptians trying to cut them off get caught in the Red Sea and drown. And so the people are saved. All right, so that's the first thing you can learn from that, is what happens when you proseize poetry. The other thing that happens is you start looking and say, what isn't in the Song of the Sea? You say, first of all, that the people don't go into the water themselves. Only the Egyptians are in the water. Secondly, the most interesting thing I think of the words that aren't in the song is Israel. It never mentions Israel anywhere in the song. It only refers to a people, an Am, who went through the water. Now that's interesting because I told you last night that the two oldest things in the Bible are the Song of Miriam, here, the Song of the Sea, and the Song of Deborah in the book of Judges. In the book of Judges, in the Song of Deborah, it mentions the tribes of Israel, or 10 tribes, and it doesn't include the Levites, which is why I think the Levites were the ones who were down in Egypt. But here you have the Song of the Sea that takes place in Egypt, and it doesn't mention Israel. Is that not interesting that our two oldest sources do that? The one in Egypt doesn't mention Israel, the one in Israel doesn't mention the Levites. So that's among the pieces of evidence that I deliberately left out last night, that the Levites were the ones who were in Egypt, and when they left, something terrible happened to the Egyptians at the Red Sea, and that changed their view of everything forever. And if you would try to make a new movie now and have only the Song of the Sea, that would be different and still powerful. I was a consultant on the movie Prince of Egypt, which was also, about the Exodus. And when I went up to DreamWorks and before I met Jeffrey Katzenberg, the head of DreamWorks, they sat me down in a room that had 3 giant computer screens like I'd never seen before. And now we all have televisions at home that are as big as that. But at the time, that was a big deal. And they showed me the film that was about 40% done at that point. And so in some parts, they just had stick figures and the voices in, but not the text. And at that point, it was the voice of Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, was going to be Mel Brooks. And then they changed it the second time I went a year later, and it was Danny Glover. And nothing against Danny Glover, but I was always trying to wonder, why did they take out Mel Brooks? And I think it was probably that anything he says sounds funny. So there was no way to make it, oh, Moses, you just couldn't, yeah, I mean, it wasn't going to work. So they took him out. But when I went there, the whole movie's in English, and this hasn't changed. So if any of you have seen this, it's an animated version of the film. And I never liked that because Michelle Pfeiffer, plays Zipporah, and Sandra Bullock plays Miriam. And to me, the idea of having Michelle Pfeiffer and Sandra Bullock in a movie, and you can't see them, for sexists such as myself, this is a terrible, terrible thing. So, okay, it's just their voices. And but when they get to the Red Sea, they sing the Song of the Sea in that movie in Hebrew. The whole movie's in English, and then suddenly they're going, Shira Ladonai, and they're singing it in Hebrew. And I was sitting there in this room by myself with these giant screens, and they did it so naturally, the transition into the Hebrew, that I didn't notice it. So then I was there, I was halfway through the song, and I go, wait a minute. They're singing it in Hebrew. When did that start? And I got all choked up. I'm a scholar, I'm a professional, but I was really quite moved by that. So then afterward, I went and I met Jeffrey Katzenberg. I said, I've got to tell you this. I mean, you don't need my praise, but I've got to tell you that I was really moved by the Hebrew Song of the Sea. And he said, I'll take your praise. And so that stayed. And it is, so the second time I went a year later, and then it was 90% done. And I came in again and I said, oh, darn, now I know what's going to happen. I've got a spoiler alert. So I know they're going to go into the Hebrew. So I was watching it and they went into the Hebrew and I started getting choked up again. I'm going, darn, he got me. So if you haven't seen that, you might do that. And meanwhile, we've got our real text in the Torah itself. Our oldest text is 1,000 years old. Our oldest incomplete text is the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is 2,000 years old. The song itself was composed well over 3,000 years ago. It is stunning. I mentioned last night that it's associated with the name Miriam, though it never says she wrote it, and it never says that Moses wrote it. And the Song of Deborah in the book of Judges gets attributed to Deborah, but really they sing it in second person to Deborah, so it may not be that Deborah wrote that. We don't know. So all we know is the two oldest things in the Bible, the two poetic things in the Bible, are both named for women. And that's interesting because the oldest poetry in the world are poems from Mesopotamia, which are over 1,000 years older than these. They're the first poems known on earth where we have the name of an author, the poet, associated with them, and they're by Enheduanna. So you may as well know Enheduanna because you might be on Jeopardy someday, and they'll say, the first named poet on earth, and you'll say, who is Enheduanna? Not Alex of blessed memory, but whoever, and you'll get it right. But the point is then the oldest things we have are associated with women. So as long as I'm in a profession that deals with a book that's 90% male, and that the biblical scholars are disproportionately male, and so on, it is an extraordinary thing that really the people who first gave us the Bible and poetry and all of this were probably women. It's enough to make a guy a feminist, So men respect your wives, especially if they're poets. I can tell you that one of the great friendships of my life was with Debbie Friedman, who is the great Jewish poet of our lifetime. Jewish meaning in terms of Jewish ritual specifically. Otherwise, she's got to compete with Paul Simon and Leonard Cohen and Dylan, which you got to admit is heavy competition. But in terms of a Jewish song, it's my namesake, Debbie Friedman. Sadly, we're not related, and we miss her. So from Deborah to Debbie, we're grateful for the women who've contributed to our poetry and our song. Is that enough for today? I'll be back at 2.
I think that's great. Thank you so much. Actually, we're not going to do a Q&A now, but maybe I can just take the point of privilege and ask one question, which is you referenced last night and again today that the song is associated with Miriam. And could you just explain how that is or where that is? Because obviously it starts Az Yashir Moshe, right? So when you say it's connected with Miriam, how do we know that?
Okay, at the beginning of the song, it attributes it to Moses, but then at the end of the song, right, it adds the following lines. The Pharaoh's army all went into the sea. And then in verse 20, it says, and Miriam, the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took a drum in her hand, and all the women went out behind her with drums and with dances. And Miriam sang to them. And what is it that she sings to them? Sing to Yahweh, for he triumphed. Horse and its rider he cast in the sea, which is the same as the first line of the song before. So you go, well, why are they repeating it like that and connecting it with Miriam? And some people think that there were two versions of the song, and one was just the one-line version, and one was the more complete version. That's wrong. I mean, that's crazy. I'll tell you why there's just the one-line version there, outside the fact that they just did the whole song, so they didn't need to repeat the whole thing a second time, is that's what's known in biblical scholarship as an incipit, not insipid, an incipit, I-N-C-I-P-I-T, which is where you take the opening line and you use it to stand for the whole thing. So it's like if we were in a school class and the teacher said to the kids, now we're going to sing My Country 'Tis of Thee. Well, My Country 'Tis of Thee is not the name of that song. The name of that song is America. And the name of that song in England is God Bless Our Gracious Queen. It is not My Country 'Tis of Thee. But everybody knows that you can say that, you know, and we'll all get it. So,
Right.
so the first days are the hardest days. Those of you who are Deadheads are supposed to know that that is the Grateful Dead song, Uncle John's Band. But that's it. When you use an incipit to stand for the whole thing, that's why we attribute it secondarily to Miriam.
Understood. Thank you very much. Well, great to learn with you once again. And everybody, we hope you'll join us again today at 2 o'clock as Dr. Friedman speaks about aliens in the Torah, the radically inclusive approach of our most sacred text. And tomorrow at 2 o'clock on the 8th day of Pesach, what happened to the pagan gods and goddesses. But for now, we're going to turn